Welcome back to ILR Performance. Today we're going to tear down a Tecate 4 complete motor. We're going to tear it all the way to the transmission and the crank. We're going to do a full rebuild on this motor. We're going to build a 330 with a long rod on a stock stroke crank. And when we're all done, we're going to put it on the dyno and see what kind of power it makes. I'm not going to go into how to rebuild a crank or how to sleeve a cylinder because those are separate videos. But if you want to see how a Tecate 4 comes apart, this would be a good motor to keep an eye on. When I tear down a motor, I always take a look for some things that I want to check out as I go along. Obviously, the amount of wear in the cylinder, piston, crank. I'm always looking to see if somebody else has been in the motor before. Let's face it, these motors are pretty old and there's not very many of them that somebody hasn't been in before. But every once in a while you get a motor that hasn't been apart, and this one looks like some of it's been apart, but it doesn't look like it's ever had the crank out of it, and probably only had the cylinder and the head off of it. But we'll see when we get into it and see what kind of shape it's in. Hopefully it's a good one. So we're going to start from the top and tear it all the way down. We need to disassemble everything because we're going to reuse the head. We're going to machine it out for the big bore. The cylinder we're going to do an exchange. We keep 330 cylinders in stock all the time, so we already have cylinders that are sleeved. So this one will go on the bench, and eventually it'll get sleeved up to a 310 or a 330. Depends on what we need later. And we're just going to start from the top and work our way down. So everything comes apart pretty straightforward. On the head, always start with the front 3 bolts. A lot of people take all the head bolts off and leave the 3 bolts to the last. When you do that, there's clamping load on these. The head wants to lift up and it always warps the head. So take your 3 bolts out first. And then go do your head bolts. Just like when you torque a head, it's always good to remove a head using the torque pattern, which is a crisscross or a star pattern. Okay, so I'll get the head off. They're usually a little stubborn, but not too bad. So you can see there's plenty of orange silicone on this one. Number one, that tells us it's been apart before. This is a horrible idea. Don't ever put silicone on a head gasket. You can see that there's a coating on the head gasket. It is a temperature activated adhesive, so that when the motor gets warm, the adhesive bonds the gasket to the cylinder. And you can see the adhesive has never really had a chance to bond because the silicone was in between the cylinder and the head, never gave it a chance to bond. Plus now you have all this orange stuff running around on the inside of your motor. So orange silicone's great for, exhaust manifolds and things like that, but don't use it on a head gasket. All right, next we're going to pull the cylinder off. You have four 14 millimeter wrench size nuts. They're 10 by 125, but they take a 14 millimeter wrench. And if the power valve cover is still on this side, you're going to want to remove the power valve cover. You can take it off with the power valve cover on it. It just pulls on the rubber boot. And since the boots are old, you don't want to tear them. So go ahead and take the 2 bolts out and pull the power valve cover off. And once we have those off, we're going to pull the cylinder. Doesn't matter where the cylinder is positioned, it's going to lift straight off, and the piston and the rings are going to let go. When you get up near the top, you want to go ahead and lean the rod forward and go ahead and lift your jug off. Take a look at the jug. You can see that this cylinder has a red base gasket. You can see that it hangs over in the port quite a bit, but this particular gasket is an OEM Kawasaki base gasket. So chances are whoever had it apart before was a Kawasaki dealer. Also, taking a look at it, we can see that it has a factory cast Kawasaki piston in it. The rings have a significant amount of wear on them, but we'll go ahead and pull the piston off and we'll take a look at those. The easiest way to get the piston off is just a sharp pick. We're going to go in to the notch in the piston, go straight in there, put your hand over it, go ahead and pop it loose, and then hang on to the circlip, put it on the bench so it doesn't end up inside the motor. Once we get that done, we can push the wrist pin out and the piston will lift right off. So you can see the bottom of the piston's in pretty good shape. There's no burnt oil on the bottom of it. There's not a lot of wear on it here. There has been some blow by here, across here, and across here. That's simply because the rings are worn out. We'll take a look. This is a great example of a motor with a lot of miles on it. So if you take a look at that piston ring, you can see how thick the rings are down here, and you can see how much thinner the ring is there. The other thing is the edge of the ring is very, very sharp right here where it's worn. It's not sharp here because there's a bevel in the ring. So this ring has been worn out a long, long time ago. That's an indication that the motor's got a lot of hours on it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but it needed a set of rings a long time ago. All right, we're going to pull the wrist pin bearing out. Take a look at it. Wrist pin bearing looks pretty good. This bottom end is in very good shape. There's a little discoloration on the rod, but that's normal because of age. There's no rust in the crank. There's no hammer marks on the crank. It rolls nice and free. Very good shape. So now we're going to want to go ahead and tear into, we'll start with the Magneto side and then we'll go into the clutch side. I like to use the engine stand because I can spin the motor around. I can work on it on a horizontal surface. I don't have to worry about dropping anything on the floor. The other nice thing is most of the motors I get still have oil in them. This allows me to drain the transmission oil if I need to when I tear into them. Now this is the area where Tecates are generally in the worst shape, and it's because they have a plastic cover on them. You need to take the plastic cover off on a regular basis. Make sure they get aired out really well, and then spray them with something like a WD-40, any of the, whatever your favorite protection or protectant lubricant is, because they will get full of moisture and they will rust. This is an immaculate flywheel. This is extremely rare to see one that's in this good a shape. There's no corrosion in the cavity. There's no damage on the flywheel. This is an original Kawasaki flywheel. It's never been replaced before. Considering the price of these versus the Chinese ones or rebuilding them, I would have to say this thing's never been off of this motor before. So, beautiful example of what a flywheel should look like. But yeah, always, at least once a year, take your Magneto covers off, clean these things out, spray them down with WD-40, put the covers back on with a new gasket. Yeah, the cost of the ignitions is well worth the effort. Okay, so as long as you have an impact, whether it's an air impact or electric impact like this, you can pretty much just hold on to the flywheel. That bolt wasn't very tight. It came off easier than it should have. However, it's the taper that holds the flywheel on, not the tension of the bolt. So not a problem. Again, bolt's in great shape. Now we're going to need a puller to pull this flywheel off the crank. This is the puller that I use to pull flywheels. I've made these special washers that are out of hardened steel. They're made to fit in the grooves real tightly, allow me to use a hardened grade 8 6mm bolt, Allen screw actually, and pull on it solid. This is a good solid puller. It's a harmonic balancer puller for a small block Chevy or a small block Ford. You can get them in an auto parts store fairly easy. They're not going to have grade 8 6mm screws. However, you can get these at a bolt store. If you don't do this a lot, you can get away with just putting a couple of thick washers underneath them and using the puller. Again, I've made these and I've had this puller for a couple of decades and it's worked really, really well. One of the things to be aware of on a Kawasaki or a Tecate is that your puller needs to go down in and push on the crankshaft. It can't push on the flywheel, or you're just pulling against yourself. So what I do to keep from damaging the end of the crankshaft, as well as to make sure that I'm pushing on the right part, I take an Allen screw. It's a 25mm long 8x1.25 Allen screw, and I put it down in the hole first and thread it down into the crankshaft, and that's what I'm going to use to push on so I don't damage the crankshaft. Okay. Now we're going to set our puller on here and thread our bolts in. It's really important that all the Allen screws or the bolts, whichever ones you're using, are threaded in exactly the same amount, but no more than 5/16 of an inch or 8mm. The reason for that is if you screw the puller bolts in too far, you will hit the coils on the stator, and you will destroy the coils on the stator when you do that. So when you go to screw them in, like I say, they need to be nice and even so that you're pulling flat, but don't screw them in more than 8mm or you're going to damage the stator. All right, now that we have this on, I'm going to tighten up the puller. And then we're going to gently tap on the puller. Never hit the flywheel. If you hit the flywheel, you're going to break the magnets and you're going to be buying a new flywheel. But if you're careful and you want to wrap only straight down, you usually get the flywheel loose pretty easy. So you see, if you do this correctly and you have a nice amount of tension on it, when you tap it, the crank will pop loose, and you'll see no damage to the flywheel. There's a little bit of dirt and dust in here, but beautiful flywheel. You haven't damaged anything. If you can see right there, those screws are just barely coming through the back side. They haven't, as long as you don't go past where the rivet head is, you're safe. But that's just screwing them 8mm. They're going to come in there. If you screw them in there too far, what you're going to find is a big mark right here on this coil. This is your lighting coil, or you're going to have a mark on this side. If you damage this coil, you lose your ignition. If you damage this coil, you lose your lights. They're completely separate circuits. However, if you damage the coil, you're going to have to replace the stator, or you're going to have the coils rewound. So again, nice stator, but be real careful when you take it off. This type of a puller works really well. If you have trouble getting the flywheel off, it probably means you don't have a good enough puller. If you buy a cheap puller that flexes and bends, it won't generate enough power to pull the flywheel off. So either go rent one that's good quality or go buy one that's good quality. It needs to be at least a 1/2 inch thick where you're pulling on it so that you get good tension on it. and when you smack it, it'll pop loose. If this thing bends at all, you can fight with it for days and days, and it just won't want to come loose. I leave the Allen screw in the end of the crank. I can take it out now. I'm done pulling the flywheel. However, later on in the video, we're going to be splitting these two case halves apart. I'm going to be using the same puller. However, I'm going to be using it in these two holes and pushing on the crank. So I just leave the Allen screw in there for now, and then I can push on it later without having to worry about it. Take the stator off now. It's always a good idea to check where the stator timing is. This one, there's 3 marks in the stator, and we'll go over that when we put it back on. This one happens to be in the center mark, which is the factory setting. I can also see that no one's ever tried to get these screws out of the case, so once again, a little bit more evidence that this bottom end's never been apart. So once those 2 screws are out, we're going to have to pull the gasket up right here so that we can get the grommet out. And once the grommet's loose, the stator will go ahead and come out. So I always put the stator inside the flywheel just to protect both of them. So if you have the flywheel and you have the stator and you carefully put the flywheel over the stator, it protects your stator coils from getting damaged while it's sitting around. It helps keep the flywheel from getting around, and it helps keep a bunch of crap from getting stuck to the inside of the magnet. So just a convenient thing. Another thing you're going to want to check is the plastic on here. You can see, even though this has been well cared for, it's pretty hard, pretty brittle. There's a couple of cracks in the rubber boot. Those are areas where the water is going to get inside of here, so we're going to fix those later. You can see there's a big crack right there, so we're going to take care of those later. But if this is damaged at all, you're going to want to get it repaired so you don't get water in your motor there. You can wait and do this part later, but I always do this so that I don't lose it. On the crank is a Woodruff key, or a half moon key, a lot of people call them. It is a very special key. You're not going to find it at the hardware store, or most bike shops aren't going to carry this key. It's unique to these 250 Kawasaki motors. So an easy way to get it out is just a pair of dikes. You grab hold of it and you just rock the dikes, and the Woodruff key comes right out. Take that and hang on to it, because like I said, it's not going to be something you're going to be able to come by real easy if you lose it. You can make them, you can take a bigger one and file it thinner and then file the curve, but it's a pain in the ass, and if you make them wrong, then the flywheel comes loose later. So put this in a safe spot. Alright, this motor already has the sprocket taken off of it. There's a sleeve right here behind the sprocket. There's also an O-ring back behind there. We'll get that O-ring off later on. This is another area to inspect. You can see this particular one has some wear here and here from the seal, but it's not really damaged too bad. So before we put it back in, we're going to put it on the lathe and we're going to polish it back up, get those out of there. If they are damaged, there's aftermarket ones available. The aftermarket ones are kind of cool because they're coated with molybdenum disulfide and Teflon, which makes the seals last a lot longer. They have a square step in them, which makes them hold the O-ring a little bit better, and they have 2 small O-rings. So if you need to replace one, there's a couple upgrades you can get that work pretty well. So now we have this off. We're going to go ahead and flip the motor around to the other side. Before we start tearing into it, we're going to take a look and see if there's oil in it. Unfortunately, there is not any oil in this motor. There will be some oil in it, obviously, when we tear it apart, because not everything comes out when we drain it, but the majority of the oil's out, and so all this should come apart pretty straightforward. You do not need to pull the water pump cover off in order to get this case off, because we're going to do a full rebuild, and one of the areas where I'll find issues with Tecate motors is the water pump seals get old and they start to leak water into the transmission. They don't get water into the motor because they're separate cavities, and you'll see that later, but I always replace the water pump seal. So since I'm going to go ahead and do a full rebuild on the water pump while I have it apart, I'm going to go ahead and pop all the screws out and pop the water pump off of the side case. It's just easier to do it now than it is later. Alright, you can see that there's two dowel pins, one pin here, one pin here. Make sure the pins aren't loose. Most of the time one pin will end up coming off on the cover and one pin will stay in the motor. Make sure the pins aren't loose. If the pins are stuck in there pretty well, just leave them alone, they're fine. Again, this is another area you're taking a look at. You want to make sure that there's no corrosion inside of here. You can see that this is dark in color. That's just due to oxidation from some of the chemicals that you'll typically have in tap water, but it's in very good shape. We're going to do a couple of mods on this while we have it apart to increase the flow. You can see this is there's a sharp edge right here from the way that they make it, plus there's another sharp edge here. So we're going to blend some of that out and get a little bit more water pump flow out of this. We can actually get the factory water pump to flow water better than the radiator core can actually pass it. So there's not really any sense in upgrading the water pump on these, because just with we're going to shim the impeller to tighten things up. We're going to open this up and we'll actually be able to get more water flow than what can go through the radiator. So not much sense in looking at aftermarket water pumps. There's not much available, but some of the KX250 stuff can be adapted to the Tecate if you happen to have a damaged water pump, or you really do want to do some kind of an upgrade if you're running an oversized radiator or something like that. Again, this is a good opportunity to spin the water pump impeller bolt loose because it's held by the crank. It's simply a bolt holding the water pump on. One of the things to pay attention to is on the back of the water pump is a washer. This washer does not go on the front. Almost every motor I get that somebody's been into, I find that they put the washer on here and then they put the bolt back on and they tighten it down like that. And what that does is that moves the water pump impeller closer to the block. It doesn't hurt anything, but it leaves a greater gap between the water pump impeller and the housing, and it makes the water pump less efficient, and it doesn't push the water through as well. So remember, always look for that washer. The thickness of that washer is critical. Well, it's not terribly critical, but make sure that you have that washer. It is 40 thousandths of an inch or 1 millimeter thick. That is the minimum that you need between here and there. Most of the water pumps, when I custom shim them, are going to take a little bit thicker washer, but we'll go over that in the assembly part of the video. Okay, so now it's simply a case of going around with all the bolts. One of the things that's incredibly awesome about Kawasaki and the Tecates in particular, all the case bolts are the same length for the outer covers. So the 6 bolts that go on the Magneto cover, the 3 bolts that go on the water pump, and all the bolts that go on this cover are all the same length. So you don't have to keep track of what went where. They're all the same length. Since the motors are made to be worked on in the future, Kawasaki always provides a pry point for disassembly that can be used so that it doesn't damage the part. Do not get your screwdriver in between the side covers and the main case and start prying around on it, Kawasaki puts a nice little tab right here that's only on the outer cover so that you can get right behind it with a screwdriver or something flat and tap on that. There's an identical one on the other side, and those are going to be your 2 points for getting it up. The only thing right now that's actually preventing this from just dropping right off is the fact that the Kickstarter shaft goes through the case and through the seal. This one has a little bit of rust on it, so we're going to have to be a little careful with it as we take it off. But all we're going to do is tap up on that till it comes up. Tap up on that till it comes up. And then we're going to tap on that shaft, and just by pushing on the shaft, lifting up on the cover and wiggling it, it'll come right off. If it doesn't come right off, you left the bolt in somewhere or something else is wrong, don't pry on it, don't beat on it, they come right apart. So what you'll see when you get it apart is this is the governor or the actuator for the power valve. This is the water pump drive shaft, and that's all that's in there. One of the things you're going to have to watch out for is this little washer right here. It always comes off with the side cover, and if you're not paying attention, it's going to fall down on the floor, disappear, or it's going to end up in your oil bucket. You're going to throw it away, and what that's going to do is that's going to allow your Kickstarter to move up and down, and it's one of the main causes for Kickstarter failure. As soon as this case starts to wear from that shaft because the thrust washer is not there, you're just going to have more and more play, and eventually the Kickstarter is going to skip. It's going to round off the teeth on the engagement pawl, and you're going to have all kinds of Kickstarter problems with it. So pay attention, make sure you know where that washer is. If you don't have the washer when you pull the case off, and the washer's not on the shaft, it's still readily available from Kawasaki. We keep them in stock all the time, but your Kawasaki dealer can get them for you. It's still a readily available part number. So make sure you save that. Make sure you remember where it went. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the clutch. There's 6 bolts that hold the clutch on. There is a spring behind each one of those bolts, and this is the clutch pressure plate that pushes down and squeezes the clutch pack together. They are screwed into a cast aluminum boss, so make sure that when you loosen these, you turn them the correct way. If you over tighten them, they will break, and your inner clutch hub is junk. We do have a repair if you've broken one of those off that bores them out and inserts a billet aluminum piece back in, so we can repair them if you have a damaged one. But your best bet is don't break them in the first place. Just make sure you're careful. Now these bolts are distinctive. The washers are captive. That means the washers won't fall off. And what you'll see is there's the large washer that holds the spring, but there's also a smaller washer that the spring centers on. There's 6 of these. There's no other bolts in the motor just like them, so keep them with your clutch springs, but those are the right bolts to put back in. If you don't have that washer on there and you were to replace them with just a bolt and a flat washer, you're going to over tighten it down onto this post. The springs are going to coil bind and you're going to do damage later. So just keep them together with the springs. So next thing we're going to do is disassemble the clutch. The plates are stuck together from the oil, so if you just gently release them, it just makes your life easier. What we're going to do is we're going to take the pressure plate off first. The plate's going to want to come with it, but since we released it, this is one area you're going to take a look at. You're going to be looking for any damage or wear. You can see this one's nice and smooth. There's no gouges. There's no steps, so there's not a lot of wear on this. This is good. They can be resurfaced if you know a good machinist, or you can send them to us and we can resurface them to get a nice flat edge on them. You can only take a small amount off without affecting the tension, but we actually have a couple of thicker steel plates to go in the back if you happen to have excessive wear, that we can compensate for that when we put it back together. So top plate comes off, and then we're going to take the clutch pack off. An easy way to take the clutch pack off, again, is just pry up on it here, and everything will come out in one piece. Now each one of these is individual, and we're gonna, when we put them back together after we clean them, there's a particular way they need to go back on to work the best. You can't just throw them back in there any which way. However, it doesn't really matter what order they go in, so when you clean them, don't worry about keeping them in any particular order. They're going to go back in a certain way, and it doesn't matter which one's top, bottom, middle. It's just the orientation inside, outside that makes a difference. Next part we're going to work on or take out is this particular item. This is the clutch actuator. This is what the clutch arm pulls on to pull the pressure plate off. Again, there is a very small washer on there. That washer is critical. This is another thing that I see all the time when I get a motor. This washer is missing. When that washer is missing, that means you have to pull up farther on this before the clutch has to before the clutch starts to disengage. That means that the arm on the side of the case has to pull farther forward before it can pull up on this. And that causes two things. Number one, it makes the lever stiffer because you've lost leverage. You may potentially run out of adjustment too early. And the other thing is the plates won't fully disengage, which means they'll drag more when you're sitting still with the engine running and the clutch in, or when you're going through the shifts, and you'll just have more clutch wear. It also aggravates the condition when the motor's cold and you put it in gear and the motor wants to die. So again, make sure you know where this washer is, and keep it with the part. Okay, the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to pull the nut off of the clutch basket and the nut off of the crank. We're going to do those at the same time, so I'm going to move the camera around, give you a little bit better view of what we got to do to get those off. The crank nut is retained by obviously the tension of the nut, plus there's a washer behind it that's cupped. That washer is called a spring washer, and it acts like a lock washer to hold tension on the nut without damaging it. On the clutch basket, for a couple of reasons, there is a tab on the back side, and you can see right there, if you look carefully, you can see that there's a tab that's bent up that keeps the nut from rotating. So in order to get this nut loose, we're going to have to bend that tab back down so that it's flat. That'll give us room to go ahead and take the nut loose. Then we're going to use a holding tool to take the clutch basket off, the inner basket, and then this is the clutch outer basket, which happens to be hooked to the crankshaft, and we're going to go ahead and pull all that off, and then we're going to lock the crank so that we can take the crank nut off. The easiest way I've found to get that tab bent back without doing a lot of damage is a nice cold chisel. You don't want a very big cold chisel because you got to get it down in there. And what you're going to do is you're just going to hold that cold chisel right in there, and then you're going to tap on it a couple of times, and the tab will bend back down. Okay. Once you've got that bent down like that, you can tap on it with a flat punch. You'll notice on this particular one, it was up against this. Make sure you don't hit that and you don't lean on that while you're tapping on the chisel, because again, that's just a piece of cast aluminum, and if you break it off, it's going to be an expensive repair. Just use a normal punch, put it on there. And that's going to tap that all the way out of the way. Now we're going to get a socket, we're going to pop that off. This is a holding tool for the clutch baskets. It's available from Motion Pro. You can see Motion Pro. You can get it online. We carry them in stock if you want to order them from us, but they're readily available, and they just work like a giant pair of ice grips. But they're specially made so that they lock into the notches in the clutch basket so that you can hold on to the clutch basket without damaging it while you take the screw loose. So you don't need to clamp this terribly tight, but you want it to snap down like a pair of ice grips. This is a 27 millimeter nut. 27 millimeter nut. Okay, now we're going to spin that loose. They're generally not on there terribly tight. You can see comes loose pretty easy. They don't have a lot of torque on them because the retaining tab holds them on. You'll see the way that this tab works is there's a couple of little notches on it that are bent downward. They hook into the ribs right here. There's 6 ribs that go across. It doesn't really care which pairs of ribs that it's on, but when we put it back in, we're going to nestle it over there and we're going to bend the tab back up. But now we're going to put these in with the rest of our parts, and we'll be able to lift off that inner hub. Once that's loose, this simply lifts off. And just like always, we're looking for washers. Right there, there's a thrust washer right there. Do not lose that thrust washer. That thrust washer has a sharp edge and a rounded edge. We're going to go over that when we go back to assemble it. But again, this washer is critical that it is where it is. It has to be between those two parts when you put it back together. So make sure you know where it is. After that, the outer clutch basket, again, simply lifts straight off. These are all straight cut gears, so you just lift up on it, and the basket will come out of the way. You're going to have a bearing. It's like a giant wrist pin bearing. There's going to be a sleeve. That's the inner race of that bearing. And there's going to be another washer. Again, Kawasaki is really nice to us because this washer is exactly the same as the washer that goes behind the inner clutch hub. So if you mix the two of them up, it doesn't really matter, just as long as you get them put back on the right way so that they properly support the bearing. So we'll go over that during assembly, but these are all going to stay with the clutch basket. Okay, next thing we're going to do is remove the crankshaft nut so that we can pull those gears off. And we'll go ahead and pull the Kickstarter idler gears and the shifting mechanisms out and get ready to pull the side covers apart. In order to get this nut loose, we're going to have to lock the crankshaft because right now this wants to spin. I suppose if you happen to have a motor that's blown up and the crank is already locked up, that's going to make it easier. And the way I do this without damaging anything is I have some shims. These are actually plastic shims that are made for disassembling motors, wedges for taking motors apart. However, what you want is either a piece of hardwood or a piece of plastic. And what we're going to do is we're going to insert this piece of plastic in between the crank halves so that the big end of the rod is pushing back against the case. It's plastic, so it won't do any damage. It'll destroy the plastic before it ever hurts the aluminum, but that's going to lock your crank in place. I have seen plenty of guys on the internet use a big pair of channel locks to hold on to that gear while they take it off, and I suppose it works, but if you slip, you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to damage that gear, and as we all know, Tecate parts aren't available anymore. This is a 24 millimeter socket. Remember, this one was a 27, this one's a 24. So you're going to just simply put that on there. It is a normal thread. There aren't any left-handed threads on any of these Tecates, so you don't have to worry about that. So you're simply going to put the socket on there and spin it loose. That's all there is to it. It's a very fine thread nut. It's not the same as that nut, so they're different diameters anyway. Here's the washer I was talking about. It's a spring washer, and what that means is the washer, I don't know why you can see that, but the washer is cupped. It's higher here than it is there. That's an important thing to remember, that the low part goes to the outside, the high part goes up. If you turn them around this way, what will happen is the inside will simply push on the edge of that crank shoulder, and it won't provide tension on the gear itself, and you'll have damage. This will wiggle around and you have damage. So remember, when it goes back together, the spring washer is angled this way so that the outside touches here and the inside moves upward. Once you have those off, this gear lifts off, and then this gear lifts off. This gear is timed to this gear. When we're disassembling the motor, it doesn't matter, but these are critical that they be timed. This is a balance shaft that counter rotates against the crankshaft, and it absorbs a lot of the vibration that would normally happen in one of these motors. So at this point in time, we're simply going to lift it off, but when we put it back together, I'm going to show you how to time that, because it's really important that you do it right. The next thing I like to take off is the balancer assembly. You do not have to take this gear off the balancer assembly to get it out of the motor. You can if you want to, but in all honesty, I think it just makes it harder. And these tabs are bent up just like the clutch one was. If you bend these tabs down, you almost always break them, and you have to find a new tab. Tabs are pretty hard to come by. What holds this in is this bolt, and there's a funky little tab that's attached to those. I'll show it to you when you get it out. So we're going to take that out. When we take that out, that tab is holding the bearing in. There's only two of them. They're not very difficult to remove. So once they've been removed, we're going to be able to lift this gear assembly out. So this is my little cheater tool. It's a Harbor Freight tool. Their alignment pry bars, I guess they were called. They come in a set of 3 different sizes, a few dollars. But what they do is they allow you to gently pry on things. And I do mean gently. These are aluminum cases, so you don't have to lean on anything, but it's kind of an easy way to apply upward load. So what we're going to do is we're going to simply line up the dot with the crankshaft. And we're going to get under here. We're going to pull right up on that. And when we do that, it's going to come right out. And this is our balance shaft. And so you can see in the case that there's a bulge in the case here where the crankshaft has to rotate. This side is on the back side of that bulge. This side is on this side. So if you have this rotated the wrong way, you're simply just going to be trying to pull this out, and you're going to damage this case. So when you get that dot lined up with the crank, that's going to allow you to pull the balancer right out, and it's going to come out in your hand. Having the balancer out now is going to save you a lot of grief when you take the balancer bearing support cover out on the other side, because now we can get in the other side and simply tap on it. Trying to get it out on the other side without having this out is very, very difficult. All right, the rest of this is pretty straightforward. We're going to simply use the circlip pliers and remove this. The gear is going to lift straight off. And there's going to be another circlip on the back side. Most motors will have a washer on the circlip here, or they'll have a washer on the circlip on the top. Kawasaki does not use a washer there, so that is one place you don't have to worry about dealing with the washer. While we're here, we're going to go ahead and take off this circlip as well, because we're going to need that circlip off in order to get the transmission out of the case later. So we may as well do it right now while we got the parts and the tools. So we're going to take this, put it over the solvent tank. Okay, the Kickstarter mechanism can hurt you. It is spring loaded. You don't want to just be pulling away on things, or it will snap, pop out, and give you an injury. So it's a good time to go ahead and pull a little bit of this gasket material off. We're going to clean it all later, but get it out of the way. This one's coming off awful easy. That's kind of nice. So what we're going to do now is we're going to undo the spring. So this spring is pulled this way, so that when we lift up on it, it's going to want to spring this way. So we're going to get hold of it with a pair of pliers, and we're going to gently lift up on it till it comes loose, and then we're going to release the tension. You can see it's a pretty beefy spring and there's a lot of tension on it. So if you were to just pry that up and pop it loose, it can do some damage to you or to the bike. And then you're going to lift up on this, and as you lift up on it, you're going to turn it that way until it pops loose. And what you've just done is this little tab was underneath here, so that when you rotated it and pulled up, it came loose. That's going to be important to know when we put it back together. Again, always check for thrust washers. There occasionally will be a thrust washer here and on the case. That is not normally true with Tecates. However, it's much more common on Tecate 3s than Tecate 4s, but if there's a washer there, that means they've used that to shim some machining tolerance. This doesn't need to be taken apart any farther than this. If the plastic thing moves, the spring will fall off. In fact, I can show you how this little plastic piece is what holds the spring in. Once the plastic piece falls off, the spring falls off. If it falls off, don't worry about it. I'll show you how to put that back together properly later on. But that's as far as you need to disassemble that, and unless there's some repair that needs to be done on the Kickstarter. Okay. The shift shaft mechanism is going to pull straight out. If the shift shaft is bent, or there's some dirt and debris on the other side, you don't really have much choice except to use a soft hammer, tap on the shaft on the other end, and once you get it that far, it will come loose. Now, you can see that this popped loose. That's pretty common. You're just going to have to carefully lift it all out, and I'll show you what you're looking for. So, there's a little shoulder washer right here that goes in there, and this spring, this tiny little spring, is what holds tension on this. I recommend that you take the spring off of this assembly, and you put the spring in a safe place. The springs are extremely hard to come by, and they will fall off in the parts washer or in your oil bucket or something. So go ahead and take it off. I'll show you how to put this all back together later. One of the things that you can see right here is, see all this silver? That's clutch plate wear. This is from the clutch pressure plate and from the clutch plates themselves. You'll see a lot of that down in the bottom of the case. Since this is way down in the bottom, you'll see that on this part, you'll see that on that. This is the silvery stuff you see when you drain your transmission oil. That's why there's no filter in a transmission to filter this out. That's why it's so important to change your transmission oil after every weekend of riding, or if you're a dune rider, at the very least after every week that you've spent at the dunes, or 3-4 day weekend you've spent at the dunes. Change your transmission oil. It's cheap, and it's the only way to get this debris out of the motor. If you don't get it out, it's simply going to continue to go back through, and you're going to have metal shavings wearing on all your parts, and everything's going to wear out a lot earlier. Last two parts that we need to take off of this side are, we're going to go ahead and take the shifter detent off. What this does is, this is the mechanism, and you'll see it in action when we put the tranny back together in the next video. but this is what keeps the transmission into its gear. It's that click that you feel when you make a shift. We're going to take that out. We're also going to take this nut loose because we're going to pull this off to make it easier to take it out later. You don't have to take this off. You can work around it. However, I just find it easier to take this bolt out. The transmission goes in and out way easier later, and you can go ahead and torque it back on later on. So this is another one of those little spring-loaded items that we're going to need to get hold of. And gently pry it off of there. This is not normally as hard as I'm making this look, but if you have hold of it, it'll only go there and it won't zing across your shop. This is another one of those pieces to make sure that you know where it went and you keep an eye on it. Now we're going to take this off so that we don't damage it while we're working on it. It's simply a screw. When you take this off, underneath it is going to be this little washer with a shoulder on it. That shoulder is the bearing surface for this to pivot on. When we put it back together, we're going to add a washer underneath here, because one of the areas that can happen is this will wobble while it's being shifted, and that can cause erratic shifts. When we put a washer on here, we stabilize this side of it and we get a better shift. But again, we'll go over that when we're doing the assembly video. So now this is out of the way. The last thing we're going to do on this side is take this bolt out. We're going to take this off, and then we're ready to split the cases. You can see that comes out pretty easy. It's simply just a bolt. You're going to lift this straight off. You can see there's a little hole there, and there's a little pin right there. That pin is loose. So let me grab a pair of pliers. You'll be able to easily get hold of that pin and pull it straight out. Make sure the pin stays with the part. Put them in a bag or put them together, because you have to have that pin in that hole to line everything back up to make it shift properly later. If you don't pull the pin out now, the pin will end up in your solvent tank or in your oil bucket or something like that, and you won't have it when you put it back together. All right, now we are ready to flip the motor back over and pull out all the bolts. Get it ready to split the cases.